15. Sin as privilege and right. The movement of history is towards epistemological self-consciousness. Man's personal movement often works to obscure and pervert this self-knowledge. As a result, man seldom is able to admit to himself what he is and what his sin means. It requires the work of the Holy Spirit for him to come to any self-understanding in these matters, and it is sanctification, the continuing work of the Holy Spirit in him, which develops this understanding. In Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, we see the meaning of sin and its appeal to man. One clear aspect in the tempter's program is the presentation of sin as privilege. God, the tempter held, had reserved a form of life and freedom for himself. This is the privilege of determining good and evil for oneself, of being above and beyond any external law. God, the tempter held, is very jealous of this privilege, but it is, in reality, open to all men. The doctrine of sin as privilege means that man has a, quote, divine, end quote, freedom from law and moral responsibility to do as he pleases. This privilege separates him from the world around him and makes him a sovereign. Whereas for covenant man, it is the image of God in us which is our privilege and which sets us apart from the rest of creation. For covenant-denying man, it is sin. The attempt to be as God, which sets man apart. Man is thus seen as the creature whose passion it is to be as God. The history of sin as privilege is a curious one. Very early, men who gained power held that sin is a privilege of power. Thus, royalty or nobility, or tribal or clan chiefs, held that certain actions were privileges of position which were forbidden to others. They held it to be their right to expropriate property, eminent domain, or possess the womenfolk of those under them. One form of this was the jus primae noctis, or in French terminology, the droit de seigneur, lord's right. This custom gave to the head man of the tribe or group, or some religious leader, the, quote, right, end quote, to sleep with a woman on the first night of her marriage. This was common to many cultures, and may have been true in Europe into the Middle Ages, although many scholars question its European history. Although the ritual custom is gone, the actual practice on the part of men in high office or positions of power continues. Even more, many girls feel that lawless sexuality with an important person is a privilege, and, quote, groupies, end quote, commonly beset famous personalities seeking such a quote-unquote privilege. Certainly, the history of royalty in Europe and elsewhere shows clearly that such a concept of sin as privilege was commonplace. Even within the past decade, a prominent historian took exception to Otto J. Scott's James I because of Scott's discussion of James's homosexuality. The historian felt that homosexuality was a royal privilege. Royal mistresses had a standing because royal sin was privileged. For centuries, royal marriages were permitted which were consanguineous and were, in terms of existing laws, incestuous. Royalty had sin as one of its privileges. The nobility and aristocracy shared this privilege to a degree. Virtue was seen as a socially necessary bondage to be imposed on those of lesser degree. The story of Voltaire and his manservant is well known. Voltaire barred talk of agnostic and cynical nature in the presence of his servant, lest the servant lose those moral virtues which Voltaire found advantageous and useful in a servant. The concept of sin as privilege became steadily democratized. The French Revolution was a major force towards that goal. The wealthy merchant classes now appropriated the doctrine of sin as privilege, joining the ranks of the nobility and royalty. The result, in the 19th century, was the era of the courtesans. As Joanna Richardson noted, sexual license had always been a privilege of the aristocracy, an element in their education, but now it was claimed by the middle classes who had risen to wealth and power. At the same time, the artist joined the courtesan and the aristocracy in viewing sin as a privilege and as liberation. The apotheosis of the courtesan marked the glorification of sin as the liberating and deifying force for man. The courtesans were painted to appear as both goddesses and courtesans at one and the same time. A famous mistress, a wild way of life, became status symbols. The Duc de Gramont-Caderousse, so it was reported, lit a cigar on a racecourse with an English £1,000 note, sick, which he had won because the crackling paper got on his nerves. By the end of the century, the area of privilege was extended. Neo-mercantilism began its development. The merchant barons began to see the free market as too confined. They were entitled to privileges as their rights. The result was the state subsidization of corporate interests. Later, unions and farmers sought like subsidies, so that the 20th century has seen the prevalence of attempts by all to gain stated support for their claims to privilege. The democratization of sin as privilege has been marked in the 20th century. The lower classes now claim the same privileges which once belonged to royalty, and these privileges have descended down through the nobility, aristocracy, and middle classes to them. This is not to imply in any way that these sins did not previously mark the lower classes to an even greater degree than at present. It is the rationale which is different. What was once theft is now a civil right and social justice. The state once served the will of the royalty and the nobility, then down through the middle class, to the present time where the state and its laws and subsidies are seen as necessarily serving the will of all. Justice has been replaced on all levels by another concept, human rights. Instead of the law of God governing all men, human rights, the law of man, must govern all. The sexual revolution extended this concept of human rights, replacing God's law, into the sexual and marital sphere. The doctrine of sin as privilege and right is thus basic to modern man. Liberation means freedom from God's law. I once heard in the early 1970s a student declare to a group of middle-aged people that they could not be free unless they practiced a number of adulterous and perverted acts as an assertion of freedom rather than as sin. None of this should surprise us. The entire point of the tempter's program in Genesis chapter 3 verses 1 to 5 is that what God calls sin is a freedom, privilege, and right which belongs to man, but which God jealously restricts to himself. For the covenant man, however, it is righteousness which is man's privilege. God's covenant is a law covenant. A covenant is a legal relationship. A covenant between the infinite and eternal God and man, his creature and creation, is also an act of grace at one and the same time. The law sets forth the righteousness or justice of God, and it is given to man as a privilege, a covenant privilege. The covenant man grows in epistemological self-consciousness as he grows in sanctification, in faithful obedience to God's covenant or law. He then finds his peace, joy, and strength in the privilege of righteousness. There is thus a diametrically different view of what constitutes rights and privilege between God's covenant keepers and all covenant deniers